All right, hello there, welcome. This is Viticulture Basics for my Viti 303 Harvest to Dormancy class at Folsom Lake College. And yeah, I apologize in advance if you're taking the winemaking class because a lot of this information will be very similar. So if this looks very familiar, you're welcome, and you've already seen it, you're welcome to pass through it. There will be some new things in the beginning though, right? So viticulture basics, right? We need to understand the anatomy of the grapevine. It's very important. So here we have this wonderful picture and some definitions for you to remember and be able to, I want you to be able to identify all these parts, right? So we have the grapevine trunk, which is the main stem of the vine. It consists of the scion and the rootstock, right? So the trunk is the whole situation. The scion is the upper portion of the graft union. That's where we have like the European portion of the grapevine coming. And then the rootstock is the lower portion of the grapevine. So the graft union and down, right? And that's typically the American grapevine portion, right? The head is kind of where things start to separate, right? So it's the main portion. We have the trunk and it starts to split into different directions. Where they meet in that center is called the head of the vine, and this is where the cordons branch off. Arms, also known as cordons, are the part of the vine that hold the canes and shoots. Canes and shoots is the stem that will grow leaves, develop fruit, and then be pruned back every year. And the reason that there's two definitions for that is that when it's young and leafy and still flexible, it's called a shoot. During the winter time, when the wood lignifies and becomes really hard, then it's a cane. So it's a shoot in the spring and summer, and then in like the winter time it becomes a cane. So shoots versus canes. Then we have renewal spurs, as you see here on the left side. This is the piece of cane that's left after pruning, in which new shoots will grow for the spring season. So you can see two little buds on this renewal spur. This has been trimmed back. When the weather starts warming up and we have more sunshine, these will actually pop open and you'll have new shoots, brand new growth coming out of those buds, right? The bud itself is a mass of tissue that contains an entire shoot and the berry set for the new season. And then we have internodes, that's the space between nodes or between buds where the leaves grow. So hopefully that makes sense. We also have the sucker here too. This is just an extra sprout or growth that comes from the rootstock portion, right? Or it can be on the scion and upper portion as well. It's basically like excess unwanted growth. That's what suckers are. And they are removed. So what type of vines do we use in viticulture? We use Vitis vinifera. Those are European grapevines. If you end up moving to like the East Coast or to the South, you might find some hybrids of European and American grapevines. You'll see those, right? There's American grape varieties, Vitis aestivalis, Vitis riparia, Vitis rupestris. These are varieties that are native to our continent and are very effective against all of the pests that we have in our soils here, right? So most wineries in the world use Vitis vinifera grafted on American rootstocks to prevent vine parasites like phylloxera from harming them. Phylloxera is this louse that will eat the roots of your grapevine and eventually like decimate your entire vineyard. That is something that is native to our continent that unfortunately we dispersed amongst the world during a time where we had no agriculture regulation. So that is why a lot of places around the world use grafted rootstocks now. So some common rootstocks are also like get like these interesting like numbers and acronym names, and that's because they were a part of like genetic breeding programs to be created in a way that was most beneficial to certain like vineyard situations. So whether you have clay soil, whether you need drought resistant rootstocks, etc., they'll take like these American rootstock varieties and then they'll breed them to get the characteristics you need. So some common ones that you'll see or hear in the industry are 10114, 1103P, 3309. So they have very bizarre names, but those are some common rootstocks that exist. Okay, Phylloxera. It's native to eastern North America. It's very small, pale yellow, sap-sucking insect. It's related to aphids. So if you like have a garden and you see aphids, they are related, and also equally as much of a pain. They like to feed on the roots and leaves of grapevines. The damage that it causes produces nodocytes and tuberosities. This invites secondary fungal infections, and then eventually will girdle the roots of the grapevines. So it'll basically cut off all water and nutrient acquiring abilities, right? It'll eventually just choke out your vine and kill it. Unfortunately, there is not a cure for Phylloxera. Once it's in your soil, it just exists. There isn't really a way to get rid of it in a way that's beneficial for the environment. So the only solution that we are aware of is to graft your grapevines with American rootstocks that are resistant specifically to this insect, right? These are the protective galls on the underside of a grapevine leaf that Phylloxera will create, which is really bizarre. So this could be a symptom that you have Phylloxera. And then we have a link here if you'd like to learn more about it. And this is what it looks like. Interesting little bug. Moving on, now that we know a little bit about the species of grapevines and kind of their purpose, and then the anatomy of the grapevine, we're going to talk about two very commonly mentioned things in the industry, and that's variety versus a clone. So a grape variety, also commonly called a varietal, they're synonymous to each other. Some researchers would very prefer you to say variety. Some sommeliers or just wine enthusiasts are used to reading varietal, so it just depends on what your preference is. So new varieties are created by sexual reproduction. So you think of a grape variety, we think of Merlot, Syrah, Pinot Noir. Those are all grape varieties, right? To create a new variety, the grapes reproduce through sexual reproduction. The male pollen parts will fertilize the female parts of the flower. They will develop a seed. There's an exchange of genetic material, right? It's all sounding very familiar from our biology classes. And then that's how we get a new grape variety. So the classic example of this is that we took Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc, we crossed them together, and then that's how Cabernet Sauvignon was created, right? For clones, it's a little bit different. So we talk about the process of cloning something, or propagating is also a good word for it. It's taking a cutting from the mother vine and then grafting it to a rootstock. So the cutting that you took and grafted is genetically the same as the mother plant or mother vine, right? So that is cloning. If you wanted to produce different types of clones, it can be a little unpredictable, but it does happen. These form from genetic mutations. So they will be genetically very, very similar, but there'll be a mutation, which can happen through stress in the environment, the accidental deletion of some of the genetic code, and then all of a sudden this clone has slightly different characteristics from the other. So a good example of this, when you think about Cabernet Sauvignon specifically, there is clone 7, clone 337, and these are just numbers to us, but clone 7 is known as the California clone. Clone 337 is the Bordeaux clone. And even though looking at them, they look exactly the same, generally speaking, clone 7 is much more fruit forward, and clone 337 contains more of that herbaceous vegetal green bell pepper component, right? So that's an example of two vines that are both Cabernet Sauvignon, but they're different clones of Cabernet Sauvignon, and they have different characteristics. How they became different was when they brought Cabernet Sauvignon to California, it was experiencing a new environment, it mutated, it developed slightly different characteristics, and then they started to clone that, take cuttings off that because they liked it so much, and then plant it everywhere, So that's how that happens. It's kind of like a genetic divergence, right? It just happens through mutations, and it happens randomly, and sometimes it works out in our favor and sometimes not. If you would like to learn more about this, I have an article linked through Testarossa. That's a winery over in Fort Bragg area. Very nice winery. They have a lot of Pinot Noir over there, so they have a lot to say about clones. There's also a decanter article talking about specifically what grape clones are. Wonderful. And then this is where our slides get really, really similar to the winemaking class, just because we all have to start on the same page. There's no prerequisites for this class, so we kind of have to there's some repetition in the beginning. So plants are really interesting because they're stuck in place, right? They have roots, and because of this, they have to use chemical strategies to respond to their environment and to survive. So this includes responses to nutrient limitation, competition, an excess or shortage of water, extremes in temperature, disease and pest pressure, and also lack of light, right? So one of the most common ones we learn about probably in middle school is something called phototropism, where if you take a potted plant, move the pot on its side, right? That means the plant doesn't keep growing out horizontally, right? Just because that's the orientation, it'll actually bend upwards because it's orienting itself in a way to get the most sunlight for photosynthesis, right? So it actually moves in a position that works well for it. So that's one example of a characteristic of plants where they respond to their environment. Here in this kind of I did not draw this. Someone on the internet drew it. This is an example of how plants communicate through fungi in the soil. So there's a mycorrhizae. Fungi will attach symbiotically to the roots of different plants and trees. It'll work as a mutual beneficial relationship where it works as a communication system. It can sense stress between plants. It can work as a network to send signals and warn other plants about diseases or pests that might be attacking one of its fellow plants. It can actually shuttle and move water and nutrients to help plants in need. It's very much like that Avatar, kind of world, the network of the trees, right? So that's real life. It's really amazing. And it all has to be thanked because of fungi. So characteristics of plants are cool. On that note, plants' first priority are to survive and reproduce, right? So in order to do that, some plants have developed characteristics like producing fruit. Fruit is typically nicely colored, it's sweet, it tastes good, it attracts animals, animals consume it, ingest it, and then end up pooping out a seed, and then that seed ends up sprouting and becoming a new plant somewhere else, right? So it becomes a mobile strategy for spreading their genetics. Interestingly enough, the seed is coated with an indigestible compound, so that way it can survive the intestinal tract of an animal, and that's just as one of the ways that they have evolved to survive, right? Grapevines are also interesting because, specifically grapevines, they're grown in a very wide variety of soils and climates. Grapevines are planted all over the world, and they're extremely hardy. They persist in nutrient-deficient soils. The crop set happens in the previous season. So, for example, we're harvesting fruit right now, but on those shoots contain the buds for next year's harvest, right? So the buds are pre-programmed this season for next year, even though we are currently harvesting fruit off the vines. Also, the grapevine root structure can be extremely intensive. It can contain up to 90% of the vine mass, depending on the soil you're in. So, they're pretty hardy creatures, or plants, I should say. There are different factors that will impact grapevine performance. A big one is soil. It's what is your soil composition? What's the amount of sand, silt, and clay? Is it rocky? What's the nutrients in the soil, right? What's the location, topography? Are you on a hillside, a valley floor? Are you next to an ocean or a body of water? These are all things that will absolutely impact your performance. And then also disease and pest pressure, right? Seems pretty common sense, but say, for example, you establish a new vineyard, but you don't put up a deer fence, and all of a sudden you don't have a vineyard because you have deer eating your vines. So very real problem, and definitely something to consider, right? So when we talk about dirt, or the most right term for it is soil, it's very important for grapevines and just agriculture in general. There's a lot to do with the health and like just the overall stability of your vineyard, right? Some things that you'd want to consider are like, what is your water holding capacity? If you have a lot of clay, you can hold a lot of water, but you might suffocate the roots. There needs to be some oxygen. There needs to be good bacteria, good fungi, beneficial insects, right? Nutrient availability to your grapevines. There's so many things that go into it. And oftentimes what you'll see in an effort to aid the soil composition is cover crop being planted. These are, as you can see in this picture up here, we see this white Queen Anne's lace flowers. I think it's also called wild radish or wild carrot. Anyways, this is a beneficial plant that grows between the rows of the vines that helps fix nitrogen into the soil. It can be mowed and tilled into the ground to add organic matter to the soil, help add nutrients, help add porosity and good structure. So there's a lot of things that go into just the soil itself, right? And here we have a picture of a hard pan of clay and how it, when it dries out, it actually cracks. And this would be very bad for your grapevine roots because it can actually suffocate the plants by limiting the oxygen in the soil. And any extreme cracking can actually sever your roots, which is not ideal. Next, we have climate and microclimate. Climate is like, you could say macroclimate, right? So all of the Sierra foothills, or even if you want to say all of the Central Valley of California, you could even be described very broadly as all of California, right? So your overall growing temperature, how much sunshine your grapevines get. Is it humid, or do you have a high instance of mildew forming, right? Do you get enough rainfall to support your vines? Do you need to supplement with irrigation, wind? All these things contribute to your overall climate. The microclimate is something that we look at when we work with our individual vines. How are the clusters doing? How is the canopy of the vine? Do we have enough sun, enough shade? Can the wind get through? Is it humid? Right? So there's a lot that goes into all of this. And sometimes I feel like agriculture and farming is kind of written off as such an old science, right? Sometimes people don't feel like it's relevant, but we live in California, and this is like one of the biggest agriculture states in the United States. We produce so much agriculture. We have very fertile soils. So it's a very important part of our economy, right? Okay. There's also the human decision part of how you impact your own vineyard, right? So kind of like I mentioned, your irrigation practices, right? Whether or not you use fertilizers, the timing of your treatments, how you treat the canopies of your grapevines, what trellising system you choose to use, what rootstocks you choose to use, how you prune, leaf removal, dropping of fruit. These are all things that contribute to the performance of your vines, and people who have like the education and experience will know, and the specific experience with the site they're working with will have a very good feel for what works best for their specific vineyard, right? But it takes a lot of time and experience to get there. There's different types of viticultural practices, and a lot of this comes down to your philosophy of how you want to farm, but a lot of it is also like how much does it cost and how much time it takes and whether or not it's actually sustainable to your business too, like realistically. So there's conventional farming, and this uses integrated pest management, also known as IPM, preventative cultural practices, and a combination of synthetic pesticides and biological control practices. So a lot going into that. This is like some of the most common types of farming. There's also dry farming, which is a style of farming that conserves water by just not irrigating at all. It totally relies on the amount of water that's left in your soil from previous like yearly rainfalls to farm your grapes or to provide water. There's also biodynamic, which is, quote, a spiritual, ethical, ecological approach to agriculture. This has a lot in common with organic. Sorry, I skipped over that one. But it takes it one step further as well. There's a lot of merit to biodynamic farming. There are vineyards that practice biodynamic farming, and they have some really interesting like philosophies and practices. Like, for example, here in this bottom right picture, one of the common practices of biodynamic farming is to bury goat horns filled with crystals or manure in your vineyard. And it's supposed to provide nutrients to your soil. You know, a lot of times they'll create like teas from certain herbs to use as nutrients for your plants or as kind of like a natural pesticide, right? So very interesting things about that. I am not a specialist in biodynamics, so I couldn't tell you much more than that. But there are links to all these practices. So if you'd like to learn more, you can. Organic farming is really a focus of not using pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, or herbicides. Lots of focus on doing things that are beneficial for the entire environment and not just scorching the earth, right? Then there's also reasoned/sustainable. This is kind of like a meet in the middle of, it's a way of farming that protects the environment with a focus on aiding and expanding natural resources, right? So this could be not running your tractor when you don't have to, right? Saving on gas, not using non-renewable resources, going towards like solar or other forms of resources that are more green. There's also fish-friendly farming. This is a certification that helps restore fish and wildlife habitat by improving their water quality. You'd be surprised how much stuff flows into, you know, rivers and lakes and ponds, all the ecosystems that are involved. Wine is highly, highly acidic and will alter the pH. It'll mess up the ecosystem and can potentially be devastating. So it's very important that we're keeping a close eye on things like that. So by no means this is an exclusive list. This is just some of the most common ones that we hear about. If you're interested in farming methods and practices, definitely look into it. There's a lot to be said, lots of specialties. These all have different costs associated with them. Some are more high maintenance than others, but all are created in a way to, you know, hopefully better ourselves and our practices every step of the way. Okay, so if you enter the wine industry or grape growing industry, you'll find that the development of the berries and the maturity of like the fruit, there's lots of things that will determine when they're ready and how ripe they will get, right? So first is the variety. Different grape varieties will mature at different times. So for example, it's September 2nd at the winery. We have harvested Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay. We're just now harvesting Barbera. We won't be harvesting Cabernet Sauvignon until October, for sure. Maybe even close to Halloween. So that's just a really good example of different grape varieties come in at different times. That works out to our benefit because we don't have time to harvest and process everything at once. So it kind of keeps a steady train of work as they come in. Also, disease and pest pressure. This can alter the composition of your fruit, alters the timing of development. A good example I have of this from my experience is dust mites. So there was a driveway, some pavement coming in at a portion of a winery that I worked at. And this person, part of the process is like pounding the ground to make it compact so it doesn't move by the time you pour the pavement on. However, they were not wetting the soil before like doing the pounding portion. So all this dust got, you know, basically mixed up into the air. It blew over into the vineyard, and our Tempranillo section was just devastated by dust mites. So dust mites had come through. They had eaten the leaves. If you don't have leaves on your grapevines, you can't photosynthesize. If you can't photosynthesize, you can't produce sugars in your grapes, right? So basically our grapes were just stuck at wherever they were at the time, and we had to harvest them just like that because the dust mites ravaged everything. So that has one example how that impacts it in a very negative way. If you have an extreme hot or cold climate, your berries will have a hard time ripening correctly. There's a reason that Mediterranean climates do so well for grapes. You're really looking for an ideal ratio of sugar to acid when you harvest. For the vine balance, it's very important that, like we mentioned, the grapevine's first priority is to reproduce, not produce grapes that are perfect for winemaking. So oftentimes we'll have to go through and we'll have to do what we call dropping crop, where we go through and we actually remove clusters before they ripen. So that way the vine has a load it can manage. It can ripen it all the way to completion, and then we can have delicious and highly flavored wine, right? That's the goal. Lovely. Okay, and then we have our student learning objectives. So hopefully that was a good introduction for anyone who is completely new to this industry. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you guys next time.